I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. May 1941. Over the English Channel and the North Sea, an aircraft, a single aircraft. It is a German aircraft from the Luftwaffe. Inside this aircraft is one man who is at the center of a mystery that has lasted much longer than the Second World War's revelations. His name is Rudolf Walter Richard Hess. He is number 2, number 3 in the Nazi worldview. Born 1894, he will die in 1987, the last man in Spandau prison, held by the Allies all those years while everyone else had been released. Why is part of the mystery of Hess. To tell the story, I welcome Thomas Lipscomb. Thomas Lipscomb has published and has written and constructed a play telling Hess's point of view in his closing years to interlocutor, who was his jailer at Spandau. However, there is also much more information available, and Thomas is here to help because there is the version of Hess we can get from history, and then there are all the mysteries that don't quite add up until you have an understanding of why Hess fled Nazi Germany, then in glory, making great strides against the British, great strides against all of Europe. France has fallen, and we're weeks away from the double cross of Stalin and the invasion of Russia. So why did Hess leave his roost, where he would have been all-powerful, to fly and crash land, if that's what he did, in Scotland? Thomas, a very good evening to you. Rudolf Hess, in this aircraft, crashes into Scotland. Why did he go there, and what was his purpose, if he did crash in some fashion? Good evening to you.
Good evening. He went to Scotland because he had met at the Berlin Olympics in 1936 an airman who was also the Chamberlain to the King of England, a man named Lord Hamilton. And he liked Hamilton. They were both flyers. Hess was quite a good flyer. He won the Jungfrau race one year. And he was sure if he could get to him, he could get to the king, and he could make a separate peace. England was exhausted and on her knees. What if he could create a separate peace so when Germany invaded Russia, it wouldn't have a two-front war?
He had trained for this, the record says, for weeks. Did Hitler, did Goering, did the Nazi lords, did they know he was on this mission?
They did indeed. Hitler helped him plan it. Hitler gave his chief pilot, General Bauer, to show Hess how to make his way through the most heavily defended airspace in the world, over Nazi Germany first and then over England, so that he could take this plane in broad daylight, fly all the way across Nazi Germany, across the North Sea, and into Scotland to his destination.
Munich Radio announces Hess's journey, but not what happened to him, 12 May 1941. That's a shock to everyone. It's remained a mystery ever since. Did England, did Westminster, did the king know he was coming?
The king knew he was coming. The king was in on the invitation. It is thought that Hess may very well have had a passport of safety from the king, but he did not have one from the Churchill government, and Hitler and Hess were violently opposed to the Churchill government.
Churchill, in some fashion, directing his agents. They take custody of him, they interrogate him. He initially gives a false name, but eventually it's revealed who he is. They verify that this is Hess, and he is interrogated and imprisoned for the next years. Why? Because
England at the time had a fifth column of peace appeasers, the kind of people who wanted a separate peace. Churchill did not want a separate peace. If those appeasers, who are very powerful men, the Duke of Westminster, who owns half of London, a lot of very powerful people like Douglas Hamilton, if they knew he was available and brought peace terms, they would have demanded that the peace terms he brought to Parliament. Churchill had to make sure that did not happen, and no one took Hess seriously.
These two countries are at war. The British have escaped, to their knowledge, the invasion that was possible the year before. But at this point, was there a conversation between Berlin and London without Hess?
Yes, there were several conversations. Goering was communicating through Sweden. The Pope was involved in another communication. There were other communications through Spain. There were any number of attempts by the Nazi government to try to get a separate peace with England. They went nowhere. Hess was the last chance.
The Barbarossa is launched in June, and Hess remains imprisoned long after that. What is the motive to keep him in jail once Barbarossa's launched, the Moscow, Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt make alliance? Why keep Hess in jail?
Well, to begin with, the plan of the Allies, all of them, was there was going to be a trial of these war criminals at the end of the war. You certainly would want to keep Hess interned as a prisoner of war until the trial, the same way we're doing with people caught in Iraq or other areas.
So they kept him in jail, but at the same time, that kept him out of communication. I read, and maybe it's inaccurate, that he was deprived of all fresh information while he was kept in jail. I think he was in the tower, in fact. Why did they do that?
Well, he moved 3 times. He came in and was put in Glasgow in Maryhill Barracks. Then a month later, roughly a month later, he was moved to the Tower of London for 6 days. Then he was moved to a villa outside of Aldershot in south of London. Finally, he was moved to Abergavenny in Wales. He was moved those 4 times to keep him ahead of whoever might be trying to rescue him, but also he went through various stages of interrogation at that point.
And the information he had, didn't it age very quickly? In other words, he is no longer operative after Barbarossa, after the alliance against Germany. Why not reveal the facts about Hess's peace mission? That's still it's still foggy.
Why reveal that there was Mr. Churchill had told everyone that Hess had an illusion there was some 5th column of Englishmen against the war, and Hess knew their names, ranks, and serial numbers. He knew the king was involved in it. What Hess had, the secrets Hess was sitting on, are secrets of state today.
Let's go to the Nuremberg trial just to begin this. Hess is tried along with all the other criminals, and he is charged with collusion with Hitler, who is now dead. But the ones who were tried, certainly Hess and Speer and others, are part of the criminal conspiracy. I understand it of the 4 major allies, Russia and America and France and Britain. Only 2 of them wanted him executed, 2 didn't, and that's why he was sentenced to life in prison. Is that
That's
accurate?
correct.
And wouldn't it have been better to kill him off if I were the Brits and the Americans?
Well, they were kind of stuck. Hess actually made one decent attempt at suicide while he was there, when he was being drugged and interrogated.
He tried to throw himself down steps.
He tried to throw himself down the stairs. So I'm sure they hoped he would succeed, all right. But once they were stuck with him, and they had to produce him at trial, which they did. But as you said, they were hoping they would convict him.
In trial, he would feign or did have amnesia. He would feign madness or was disoriented.
Well, a wonderful man you probably knew who died recently, Joe Persico, wrote, I think, the shrewdest book on Nuremberg, and he agrees with me that the whole thing was feigned. Hess was having no problems whatsoever. His job was to appear crazy enough so the Americans would be against executing him.
This is to Spandau prison. Hess now goes into Spandau, which is under Allied Control Council. Those are the 4 big powers. And it's now 1946. And when we come back, because Thomas Lipscomb's play is in Spandau from the 1960s, we need to race ahead because all those years Hess has secrets that are being kept. And how? I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Thomas Lipscomb is the author of a play, Last Man in Spandau, and an afterward, which I've read to explain the mysteries of Rudolf Hess. We've gotten him to Spandau prison, which is under joint control of the 4 majors, Britain, France, the United States, and Soviet Union, and now Russia. In your play, Thomas, a man named Byrd, an American officer in the late 1960s, confronts Hess and begins a lengthy conversation. To what end?
Byrd was trying to do what he could to... Hess was the last prisoner in Spandau. He had a ridiculous job with hundreds of cells that were empty, a 200-man guard, all the rest of this. His career was going nowhere, and he wanted to get a book out of Hess so he could make a lot of money. and that was his job. He also had Speer design his house for him while he was a prisoner. So Mr. Byrd was a dirty bird indeed.
Speer had been released earlier. He wrote a book. It was very popular in the 20th century. I don't know why. That's lost history. We're staying with Hess here. Now, Hess is alone. One man, Spandau is in Germany. One man alone, and around him is the Cold War. Is Hess's information dangerous to the Cold War?
Very dangerous to the Cold War, because if the Russians could get that information, they could destabilize the monarchy of England.
Because
they could also destroy the myth of their finest hour. Remember Churchill saying, never during his administration did anyone discuss a separate peace at any time?
Yes. And Churchill had, through Hess and through negotiations with the Germans, prior knowledge, at least significant understanding that the betrayal of Moscow was possible in those critical weeks. So
and Churchill was an enemy of Russia. If you remember after the First World War,
always an enemy, yes.
Absolutely.
Now, your play involves this conversation, this relationship. You'd almost say it was a fencing match between Byrd and Hess. Byrd existed, correct?
Yes, he did.
And you met him.
I did indeed.
And Byrd, at the time you met him, was pondering the information he had. What happened to it?
Well, it was interesting. You know, you're a newsman, and you quite often will talk to someone who's got an amazing historical position where he's right next to someone we're all dying to know a secret of. What happened to Mary Jo Kopechne, et cetera. He had all this. He had absolutely no idea what the world wanted to know about Hess. When I met with him, he told me all kinds of stuff that was totally useless. So I gave him a list of questions we wanted to know from Hess, and he went back and was just starting to get answers when he was thrown out in his job for abusing his authority.
This is the 1970s.
The 1970s, yeah.
1970s. And his information was still intact. He did eventually publish some of it.
He published the information he had, but he still had the old laundry list stuff that wasn't of any interest or any news interest. It came to me. I turned it down.
The German government, no longer a Hitlerite government, but passing through various stages of democracy, was Hess's information a danger to the German government?
Not really, except that he was a very attractive figure. Imagine Germany staggering towards trying to go for reunification in the late Cold War. And they have a neo-Nazi problem because in West Germany, some of the neo-Nazis and the right, the Republikaner Party, is trying to get some traction. What happens if suddenly we find Hess was a peacemaker, did everything he could, and Nazi Germany wasn't so bad after all? They wanted a separate peace with the West.
Lord Hamilton or the King or any of their agents, did they publish their memoirs or biographies? Are there notes or contemporary letters to support the peace plan?
There's a lot to support the peace plan, including stuff from the Foreign Office of the United Kingdom right now. I've got a 67-page report that is all about the peace plan.
Hess's death, August 1987. He's 93 years old. He's no longer living in a jail cell. He's living in a house that they've constructed in the prison garden. And he kills himself. Is that accurate? Everyone thought it was, but the British made a mistake. British claimed that Hess had tried to loop a cord for an electrical appliance through a window and then hung himself with it 3 feet off the ground. However, it turns out that the autopsy conducted by Hess's son, when he was given his father's body by a superb pathologist in Munich, found he'd been garroted. This is Wolf Rudiger Hess, who puts his own career at risk in pursuing explanations for his father. He
does indeed. And imagine Rudiger Hess now finds, the pathologist says, he's been garroted. Do you know the difference between being hung and garroted?
Well, one is murder. I know that much.
Well, garroted could also be an official form of execution. The Spanish used to use it, okay? In a garrote, we learned this in the Army, you take something and you put it around a person's neck, you put your knee in the middle of their back, and you pull it straight back. And what you get is a perfect circle around the neck where the garrote was applied. If someone hangs themselves, you get an oval under the chin, which stops the rope, and back up the back of the neck. That's how it should have looked. The pathologist found a total circle around the neck of Hess.
Hess was buried in the family plot at Seidel in March of 88. However, the plot, that burial, became a problem because the neo-Nazis gathered there. What was the threat of the burial site?
The burial site was just fine for many years. Neo-Nazis started to march there on the day of his death, maybe 2,000 of them. At one point, 5,000 in 2005, at which point the German government banned all further demonstrations. There hadn't been a march since 2005. So why do you dig him up in 2011?
They dug him up and they burned his body and scattered the ashes. And they've destroyed the grave marker. Correct? It's
that's
all gone.
Correct. All that's gone. And he had other family members of that grave marker. It wasn't just him.
2017, you note in your afterword that 2017 is a significant date. How so, Thomas?
That's the date in which the British Public Records Office has a suspense date. All documents held by governments have a suspense date on them. And the suspense date by which the government will let us all have access to everything they have on Hess is 2017.
And in those documents, what will we learn?
Well, I just learned because of an article about my play in the London Times. The head of MI6's historical group, a professor, sent us a note saying, here's everything in the files, and he sent a whole bunch of stuff on the medical and interrogation with drug truth serum of Hess that only took place in 1941 for 4 months. That was all that was in the files when he and the head of MI6 told us there is nothing else in the Hess files.
Hess, before his death, and he was in and out of communication, talked about having a great secret. Do we know what he was talking about?
Yes, he knew the secret of the ongoing negotiations between Britain and Germany for a separate peace, and he knew the conditions under which the peace would have taken place, and it would have rocked post-war Europe.
60 years later, with the major states still positioning themselves, but you'd have to say this is of archival interest. What's the hesitation now for London, if not for Moscow?
For London, we have the myth of the Second World War. Here, England is on the brink of possible dissolution with Scotland hiving off, maybe Wales. Is this a time in which the most glorious days the English can think of, if they don't think of Henry V, World War II, when they stood alone against the world? Can they afford to have that myth blown up in their faces at this time?
Thomas Lipscomb. The play is Last Man in Spandau. It's a conversation over many years between Byrd, the American officer who was the jailer, and Rudolf Hess, who goes to his grave and then beyond his grave to ashes and then from ashes scattered with secrets. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show.